All Souls Day, in the specifically monastic life, it's very dense. I remember how in the early hours there was a very large number of private masses happening. You might actually be called to serve them. At La Trappe there were many altars, and on that day they were still used. And one actually found reality that day, as indeed on any funeral. We would go in procession through the cloister, through the gates, those massive stained glass window gates that open only for a funeral and for that procession, and we would pray at the tombs of our brethren. And on those wonderful stained glass window gates which opened, there were two crosses. On the first big one on the left, it said in Latin, Cistercienses in pace, the Cistercians in peace, resurrectionem, on the second one, expectantes, expecting the resurrection. And they were bright when the sun would come through, and our brethren were going towards the rising sun. Indeed, our whole life was going towards the rising sun. Hope. And there would be funerals because there were quite a few elderly brethren as well, and so they would die well prepared. And it was a day of great joy, not sadness. The sadness was in the farewell, but it was just farewell for now. It wasn't adieu, mais au revoir, until we meet again. And they were felt, these deaths. There's nothing clinical about them, because one is right next to the dying brother until he dies, watching one after the other, lest he die alone. And then after, the corpse is exposed, visible and open, in the Abbey church, with the Paschal candle lit next to him. And again, he's not alone. One is praying next to him. And then, still without a coffin, the body is placed into the ground visibly, and the earth is put on the body. And the grave itself has to be dug visibly with shovels and sweat by the brothers. The brethren themselves dig the grave of the next one to go. So death is not far away, and one is not shy of it. On the contrary, I would often pause at these tombs and think about the victory they had gained. This morning, before you came, I did something of that. I paused just outside because, as in the monastery, as here too, I have graves, because the advantage of living next to graves, as in the monastic life, is that one is always in contact with reality. As far as we can see it, because we can't actually see beyond it. We can see up to the full stop, but we can't hear the next sentence. And so it is that when one pauses in a graveyard, one tries to listen to the next sentence. In a monastic graveyard, there's a certain peace there, and actually one knows this or that about such a grave because one knows who's in there. And we would hear on the grapevine that such and such, perhaps before we'd got there, actually died in odour of sanctity. There was a certain Frère Tarsisius who was known to have been a great saint, but no one knew about it outside the monastery. And we knew also, and this was something which hit me, that it was a huge family. When one of the brethren died, Frère Marie was an old lay brother, still wearing the brown, who had gone through the whole regime in its utmost penance. Not the abbot, but the prior that day gave a talk in chapter. He was also my confessor, and a very, very good man. He was probably the world expert actually on the spirituality of the reformer of La Trappe, Abbé de Rancé. And he started his conference in the chapter with this: Frère Marie est allé à la grande trappe. La grande famille est au ciel. He's gone to the great trappe. The great family is in heaven. And he indicated how there's a huge number of our brethren waiting on the other shore for us to come here. And it's true, because in one of these ancient monasteries, with an unbroken tradition going back to the 1100s, because there was never a break in the community, they had to go into exile, but the community always carried on. One is aware, and this is the point that he was making, it's a huge family. So the real reality is invisible. And life is short. They're safe. They've just got to follow. And we'll follow just the same railroad which keeps you from going to the left or to the right. It's a safe path. Here, it's not the same. When I pause there, although it's a monastery, those who would have lived in the monastery itself would have been safe. There, one is handling lay people. And actually, it's a curious graveyard, still in use slightly, and it's ecumenical. And in fact, I hear from the local people that until recent times, because it was state property, as it were, way back, the Anglicans came into the main door in their coffin to be buried, and the Catholics were tolerated. They allowed them to come into the kind of side door into their tomb. Interesting. And one sees the difference also between the Catholic and Protestant tombs. Catholic ones have often something of Our Lady or the Sacred Heart and a prayer or whatever, indicating one can protect, that's Catholic. And the others sometimes hang on to things like Justice of the Peace or whatever. One can see that that's an Anglican style. But then one sees, probably, if one goes back in time, the older graves, they would be safe because it was an age of faith, either Catholic or Protestant, they would pray. And the closer one comes to recent times, one wonders, is that the same? One is looking at a fairly recent grave which has this on it: such and such, mourned by his dear partner. So it's as it were in the face of God, saying the partner is okay. Now, let's just look at this. One can do the same in many a graveyard and see exactly the same evolution. Not far away is a very ancient monastery, going back to Celtic times. It's this one actually. It's Monaster Boyce, with those famous standing crosses, with actually a very pertinent lesson in the high cross of Murdoch's cross, that big one. It's got everything, the whole Gospel, the whole Old Testament in it, and in the middle it's got Calvary, of course, which saves us, and it's got very close to there the judgment, and this poor naked soul in the balance, with a demon trying to pull it down, an angel trying to pull it up, and the poor soul wondering which way this is going to go. And of course in those days they got the message, that was their pulpit, and it still speaks. And one can say what one likes, but as the Gospel reminds us, he reveals himself to the simple. So these people probably had more with regard to their preparedness than many a sophisticated soul now. And the proof is this: just by that high cross of Murdoch, you've got tombs, but very close to it is a very recent tomb of a man of about 19, and it's got in it a football pitch with a football in the middle and boots and everything, and indicating what was important. Okay, we leave it to that and to the Lord's mercy with regard to how that soul is handled. But one sees how very, very different it is to see how between that Murdoch's cross with the Last Judgment and this one with the judgment of a goal or not is a big, big difference. And it says it all! Because actually that's exactly the shift in importance and the shift in emphasis that we have over the centuries to our time. We don't really take it seriously. And we take very seriously a football match. It is well on this day to face our own death by anticipation. Because calmly in a graveyard, mentally one can do that. We're not here that long. I pause and I face. I pause and I think. And I relive also what hit me very strongly in another ancient place of prayer, Glendalough. I went there when I was a novice years ago, in the early 90s, with a nun. And I noticed one grave, and it had 2 words on it. Siste viator. Traveller, halt.